In this segment, we're going to focus on the material covered in Schiller, Chapter 9, Role of Government in Economy. If you remember, we started off by looking at the two-good economy model to simplify, in which, let's say, an economy that can throw all of its resources, land, labor, capital, and produce nothing but computers, and that's the quantity that it can produce, or it can zero on the other goods, or conversely, throw all of its resources to produce all other goods and zero on computers, and most often, of course, logically, a combination of the two, and that is depicted by this curve called production possibility frontier, which is a curve reflecting different combinations of these two goods that can be produced, such as A, B, or C. And if we were inside the production possibility frontier, of course, we were producing less of one or both goods, and therefore the objective was go toward the production possibility frontier. The question is A, B, or C the optimum? If these are driven by market forces, meaning that price signals has sent the producers to make this combination of computers or all other goods or this, the question is that is this the right combination? And there are times that it may not be. So let's look at the cases where market will fail to send right signals at right time so that the outcomes of the outputs and resource allocation to be correct. And one example or case that the market mechanism may fail is in the case of what we call public goods. Goods are public when non-exclusionary rule applies, meaning that people who didn't pay for it cannot be excluded from access or consumption. If that's the case, then the good is called public good. Examples are public safety, police protection, national defense, public health. These are measures that if they are put in place, you cannot select certain individuals to have access and exclude others. So non-exclusionary rule or nature of a product will determine whether something is public or not. Again, public park across your street is one example. Private goods are not subject to exclusion of those who do not pay. So if you pay for a hotel room or an apple, that's yours, is not something that others can have access to. So as long as we have goods that fit into this non-exclusionary condition or rule, then they are public goods. And so the next question is, how do we produce it? Because we have a problem of what we call free riders, people who would like to consume police protection or national defense or public park without paying for it. Because that problem exists, you cannot exclude and therefore you cannot charge, then we have a problem to pay for it, and the only way we can resolve this is through taxation. Once you introduce taxation, then the government is in the picture. So if we live in an environment where there is no such a thing as public good, everything you consume must be paid for, including clean air, including police protection, otherwise you'll be excluded from it, then that's one thing. But if that's not the case, then taxation will enter into the picture, and taxation is managed by government, therefore government is into the picture. Another condition where the market may fail is presence of what we call externalities or spillovers. They can be positive spillovers, such as education or health, or negative externalities, such as auto pollution, secondhand smoking. If you pay 50 cents for a banana and then throw the peel in a hallway and somebody trips over it, you paid 50 cents on a private side, but somebody has to pay $20,000 for multiple fractured bones as a result of what you caused. That's an example of extreme externality. To define it, is externalities or costs or benefits of a market activity borne by third party or someone other than immediate producer or consumer. Again, an example would be secondhand smoke. If one purchases a pack of cigarettes, it is a market activity. And secondhand smoke is an externality that is borne by someone who stands nearby, has nothing to do with the consumption, and yet is suffering the consequences. So therefore, the secondhand smoke can be considered as a social cost. Same thing as pollution. Someone who walks or rides bicycle imposes no pollution on a society, but someone who drives a car, it does, and someone who drives a larger car with a lower gas mileage obviously is imposing higher level of pollution and therefore higher social costs. So let's look at these things from the demand or the consumer side. Consumers, when they purchase product, they will only look at their own interest and benefits drawn from the consumption of a product. Let's say in the case of automobiles or cars, there is a price and quantity and there is a market price. Consumers will decide based on their need and desire for cars, a demand curve that reflects that need, and is called private marginal benefit, or otherwise referred to as the demand curve. And at the going price, this is the quantity that at the market level the consumers will purchase, only considering their own personal utility for the product and the benefits that they receive. However, from a societal point of view, too many cars is not desirable. They pollute, they cause congestion, we have to raise taxes to build more roads and bridges and parking spaces and traffic lights and so forth and so on. So therefore society would actually prefer to have less private cars, and so therefore the demand from a society's point of view is smaller for automobiles than there is a private demand for automobiles, and the difference is essentially the external cost associated with owning and operating automobiles. So here we are trying to make a distinction between private marginal benefit reflected with the private demand or market demand curve, as opposed to social marginal benefit of a product, which is the demand by the society for a certain product. So in the case of private cars, the demand is is greater than the social demand for private automobile. So however, let's say look at the case of a public transit. On the other hand, the private or market demand for automobile is this level at this price. However, the society's demand for public transit is larger because it has positive externalities. It reduces congestion, it reduces the pollution, and so forth. So therefore, from a society's point of view, we should have more public transit than less. So again, this is a case where public transit is considered to be benefiting the society as opposed to the private cars. Now let's look at the same issue from the externality from the producer side. There is, let's say, coal generated power, and here we have the price, and there's a market price for this product. Here we have marginal cost at the private level, meaning that the power plant incurs expenses for labor, material, other resources to generate the power from coal, and they have a cost structure. On the private side, all the expenses that they write a check for, that represents also their supply curve. So they have also an average cost curve. Now at this point, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Here, by the way, is a marginal revenue curve, and that's the level of output they produced. if they were only to consider their own immediate private expenses to generate the output of electricity using from coal generated power plants. However, if we force, because of course this firm is polluting and causing social costs, people who live around or even sometimes hundreds if not thousands of miles away, they suffer from let's say acid rain caused by sulfur emission that is dumped through rainfalls hundreds of miles if not thousands, and destroys forests. So people far away from the production and consumption of the power by a power generator plant is suffering the consequences. Now imagine that we would approach this firm and say that you must internalize your externalities, meaning to go ahead and absorb this cost that you're imposing on society into your business. If they are forced to do so, then the cost structure will rise. Remember when we talked about the supply curve? This was the original supply curve for this level of output. If the cost structure did rise, then the supply shifts to the left. Same level of output has to be priced higher to recover the higher cost. Here is exactly the same thing. Marginal cost represents supply curve. If we add social marginal cost to the private marginal cost, that shifts the cost structure up to the left. So this is again the supply curve. Now at this point the level of output will drop. This would be the level of output on the market mechanism. This would be the output if we force the firm to incur the expense of cleaning up the pollution or installing technologies to reduce or eliminate the pollution. That will increase the cost and shift the marginal cost to the left, also raises the average cost. And as a result, if you look at profitability, at this price, for this level of output, marginal average cost is here. So the level of profit per unit is here, this level. However, when the marginal cost and average cost rise to absorption of the social externalities, then not only the output falls, but at this level of output, average cost is here. So you can see that the profitability is reduced, and that's why you hear so much during election times and so forth that there are people who argue that we must reduce regulations on some firms and industries in order to make them more profitable so they can create jobs and all that. What they don't tell you is that we have to remove their obligations toward damages that they may cause, and so therefore let the general public pick up that externality through lung disease or through other health related issues as a result of pollution in the atmosphere. So therefore the question is, who eventually pays for this? There is no such a thing as free lunch in economics. Somebody will pay one way or the other. The question is, now if you remove any regulations or environmental protection from, let's say, a power generated coal power generated the plant, then they would not invest in any pollution reduction technologies. Of course their marginal cost will not shift to the left, stays where it is, they remain profitable. However, that doesn't mean that the society is not suffering the consequences. And again, several years ago, more than a decade ago, a significant amount of New England forests were destroyed by acid rain from Midwest power plants. So the question is, do we want to allow that, and is it okay? And of course that had penetrated into Canadian territories as well. So that's the second case where market will fail and the role of government in terms of imposing fees and or regulation plays a role. The third scenario or case where market will fail is a case of market power. When firms become too large and too powerful, then they gain market power. They will lose the incentive to offer products at competitive prices. They may actually reduce output in order to hike the prices, etc., etc. And when those activities appear to be against the interest of the general public in terms of quantity of goods to be provided at reasonable prices, then government usually intervenes in terms of regulations or antitrust laws and policies. And all of these are designed to prevent too much market power by some firms in order to protect the interest of general public. Again, these are all very hotly debated topics. You have to understand these concepts in a fundamental way to be able to sort out the commentaries and points made by politicians with regard to regulations and the role of government and antitrust policies. For example, many years ago, Microsoft was threatened to be hit by antitrust laws because they had dominated the operating system for computers, and so to a point that actually they gave $30 million. This was 2 decades or more ago, to Apple to prevent Apple from going bankrupt, in order for their operating system to be an alternative, at least, albeit at that point nominally, so that Microsoft would not be classified as a monopoly in computer or PC operating system. Europeans still consider Microsoft as a monopoly or near monopoly, and in fact they have been imposing significant fines in a magnitude of several $100 million to force Microsoft to open a source code so that other applications could be developed to run on Microsoft operating systems such as Windows 7 and so forth. So that's another case where the government enters into the picture in an economy. And finally, a case of inequity. Market and market forces basically signals who wants to buy what, and they produce and respond. However, there are children in a society, there are people who are poor, there are people who are ill, people who don't have a strong voice in signaling as to where the resources need to be allocated and what goods need to be produced. And when that happens, then governments usually step in on behalf of those people to make sure that the resources are not diverted entirely from goods and services that would be beneficial to those people. Let's say someone who's poor and handicapped. The society will not be very much interested in providing wheelchair or technologies that would be useful to someone who's poor and handicapped, and so therefore the government has to step in and make sure that some resources are reallocated for the benefit and interest of that social group. So that's where you have transfer payments and in a form of food stamps or welfare programs are introduced. So that essentially wraps up the discussion about the essence of the or the logic behind the role of government. I'm going to pause here, and we will be discussing, so you can stop and answer questions for discussions. Number 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 9, and then for problems for this chapter, page 203, problem number 2 and 6. So you may pause and continue with this, because I'm going to quickly respond to these questions. Question number 1, why should taxpayers subsidize public colleges and universities? Well, the reason is that this is a quantity of public colleges, price or tuition. There's a price, let's say. uh, Private demand for this product, public education, is determined by this curve. That's market or private demand. However, college education has social benefits, social the positive externalities. So for that reason, society, practically all societies throughout the world, will subsidize, because we would like people to consume more college education than otherwise. So therefore, this would be demand from a societal point of view, and that explains why we subsidize college education in order to push the demand to a higher level than it would be otherwise. That's all sorts of financial aid to students and so forth is the reason behind this policy. Question number 3: could local fire department be privately operated with services sold directly to consumers? No, because when a house is on fire in a neighborhood, it can spill over into houses around it. And if we sold fire protection to some households in certain neighborhoods and others didn't purchase it, when somebody's house is on fire, if they didn't pay for it, so you would argue that okay, they'll see their house burn down, except that it can cause the fire to spread into neighboring homes that had paid for the fire department. So this issue of fire cannot be contained, and therefore private individual sale of fire protection would not be feasible in the interest of everybody. What problems would be involved in such a system? The problem would be non-exclusionary rule of fire protection, because if you protect some, you definitely are protecting the neighbor who didn't pay for it. So that's really the condition there. Number four, identify specific government activities that is justified by each source of market failure. Let's say in a case of public good, government is involved in public parks, national defense, activities offered by Center for Disease Control, etc. In a case of externalities or spillovers, again, the government on the negative side imposes fees for polluting firms and so forth, or taxes, let's say alcohol or cigarettes, because the consumption of alcohol and cigarette has a spillover health and safety and security for everybody else. So that's why they impose taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, and then subsidize products that the society would prefer to have more of. And in a case of let's say market power, of course, the government has antitrust policies and laws to discourage firms trying to gain significant market power, and therefore work against the interest of the general public in terms of prices and the quantity of goods and services available. And finally, the transfer payments such as Medicaid for the poor or food stamp and so forth are examples where the government gets involved. Because, why do we provide food stamp? Because as citizens, the thought that some people are starving terribly, or children who are born into poor families do not have access to medical care or food is a disturbing thought for many of us, and therefore the government will tax one group to provide those services for the other. Number 6, does anyone have an incentive to maintain auto exhaust control devices in good working order? Well, not everybody does, because if auto exhaust is something that you just drive, and by the time it pollutes is behind you, then why to bother to spend extra money, several $100s more for a catalytic converter, or get your car and make sure that has a good tune-up so that it would not malfunction. Sometimes it's cheaper to drive a car with a bad engine than it is to try to get it fixed, and therefore you've seen some of the poor families drive a car that seems to have a very bad exhaust or emission problem just because they can't afford it. So therefore, if you left it entirely to private costs and benefits, many people will not pay for a car that has catalytic converters, even though collectively they hurt themselves. But the most of individual myopic thinking is that I'm not going to incur the expense, why to bother. Number 7, suppose we established a 10,000 fine for water pollution. Would some companies still find that polluting was economical? Yes. If they have to spend more than $10,000 to reduce their water pollution that they dump into the river, then they would pay the fine and skip any kind of technology that they need to introduce or changing the way that they actually use water or process, and so therefore they will pay the fine as opposed to pay for the change in the processes and or technology. And number 9, for companies produce virtually all breakfast cereals, how might this concentration of market power affect market outcomes? Well, if there's a strong influence or market power, breakfast cereals, this is the price. There is a demand and a supply. If this demand reflects a heavy concentration of the firms in the industry, the price that these firms collectively introduce would be higher than if this demand curve was more horizontal and therefore reflected more competitive nature. So therefore, and at the end, the the quantity of goods in the market will be lower than if this was a competitive industry. So market concentration of a few firms dominating a certain product will work against the consumer. Now, as far as the problem for questions for discussions, here is the end of it. Now for the problems, number 2, draw market demand and social demand curve for flu shots. So flu shots on a private basis, some people take their chances, avoid hoping that they won't catch flu, so this was the demand curve. However, we want more people to get flu shots because that will reduce the number of incidents, and it would impact the labor productivity as people miss work, let alone the pressure on the healthcare system as people are treated for flu. So therefore the society demand for flu vaccine is higher than the private demand would be, and so that essentially captures that. And number 6, redraw figure 9.4b and indicate the amount of profit that would be sacrificed if the firm adopted less polluting technologies. So 9.4b, here is the 9.4b. If the firm introduced less polluting technologies, of course, before this is the marginal cost, this is average cost, and then if you trace it from here, that would be the profitability between price and average cost. When they have to incur expenses, that pushes the cost structure up, shifts the more supply curve to the left, and then as a result you have the new average cost, and this average cost will intersect the quantity that was decided and bring it to this level. So you can see that the profit region was this area before and is reduced to this level as a result of introducing pollution control technologies and so forth. With this discussion, we have wrapped up the conversation on chapter 9, and I will conclude here.